Hi, everybody. So, this is episode 7, part 48, and on YT, part 11. And as a reminder to all my new followers, this whole channel is about rediscovering the history of our beautiful island. These videos are for all of us, born and raised outside of the island, so that we can better understand our history, our culture, and who we are as a people. I have covered so many forgotten Taino and Taina warriors so far. And in this part, le toca a los Tainos de Higuey. And the thing is, Higuey was the last part of the island to be pacified. But because they were so belicosos or warlike, we don't have a lot of information of individual Tainos of Higuey. I've taken all the bits and pieces that we have and have put them all together so that we can learn a little bit about all of the Tainos that we know of from Higuey. The first mentions of Higuey and its kingdom come from the second voyage of Colón, when after he comes back looking for La Navidad, he looks for Guacanagari. So Guacanagari was the cacique of the Cacicasco of Marian, the pink one here, and he needed to speak to him urgently. So after getting all the details about what happened to La Navidad, Guacanagari tries to make an alliance with Colón. And part of that alliance was informing him about the political structure of the island. So he tells Colón about the different caciques who govern these sections of the island: Jaragua, Beecho, Maguana, Caunabo, Magua, Guarionet. And in the farthest eastern kingdom named Higuey, there was an older cacique named Iguanama. At least that's what Bartolomé de las Casas tells us. We have some contradictory information about who exactly was the cacique in this kingdom. Through Oviedo, we hear that it's not Iguanama who is the cacique anyway. It's someone else called Cayacoa. Now it's actually believed that Oviedo was confused. Cayacoa was actually a section or a province in Higuey, and that the cacique of that province was probably also named Cayacoa. He gives little details though, that supposedly he had a wife, and the wife was called Inés de Cayacoa, and that she later on married Miguel Diaz. We already know that Miguel Diaz was with a cacica de Santo Domingo. Did he maybe have children with her and then also with Inés de Cayacoa? The facts are kind of all jumbled up. However, it is currently believed that yes, the cacique of Higuey at the time of Colón's arrival was Iguanama. Bartolomé also notes that he's not sure if Iguanama was like her actual name or if it was like the title of the cacique in this area. He says maybe it was like Pharaoh, Pharaoh being the title of the Egyptian kings, not their name. Being farther east, Higuey was not at the center of the conquest when it began. It ended up being isolated, really, from the rest of the island. What we do know up to now is that the Tainos in this area are assumed to have been los Higuayos, who were known to be great warriors, unafraid to attack, unafraid to protect their territory. Bartolomé de las Casas describes the Higuayos of Higuey as being known warriors, belicosos, who usually confronted any unknown visitors with their canoes armed with poisoned arrows. As the stranger approached, they would signal to them that they were going to bind them and take them prisoners. Because Higuey was captured last or conquered last, we have more details about the people, the technology of this region. We also have more detailed descriptions of the people, their behavior and their reaction towards the Spanish. When the Spanish began conquering the other areas of the island, people fled towards Higuey. As the name Higuey meant, it is believed it meant hijos del sol or de piedra, depending on the Taino dialect. Being part of the Higuayo kingdom, their fame preceded them, so the other Tainos quickly thought of them as their refuge. It was never recorded what exactly happened to La Cacica Iguanama. What is described by Bartolomé de las Casas is that she was hung very early on in the conquest, because the Spanish believed that if they could get rid of the caciques, they could easily dominate the people. But apparently, Iguanama wasn't the principal cacica of the area. There were others who were more powerful. The only mention of Cayacoa, like I said earlier, was from Oviedo, and he says that this cacique also died very early on. So with these two caciques out of the way, Santo Domingo being established in 1496, and La Fortaleza Osama, the wooden one, not the one that's there now, up and erected, they decided to basically impose a tribute to El Cacique de Higuey. This cacique, though, is not mentioned by name. We have no idea what he was called. But this cacique was ordered to provide tribute in form of cassave, and he happily complied. He did not fight back against the Spanish. So he planted rows and rows of yucca in order to make this cassave. And from Santo Domingo, they would send out boats to transport the cassave, because this was the cacique of La Isla Saona, or Adamanay. And this arrangement was established for a long time, peacefully. But then one particular boat, called La Salamanca, the captain of this boat was on good terms with the cacique. Bartolomé de las Casas describes how the cacique would readily hurry his people so that they would load the boat so that they could leave fast. But on one of these trips, one of the sailors had a dog. The cacique didn't seem to mind the dog. He was his usual self with his staff, his regalia, his staff being a reflection of his nobility within the Taino community and his high status. So he wasn't paying any mind to the sailor who was struggling to keep this dog under control. These dogs were ferocious and were specifically trained to tear people apart. Bartolomé says that as the sailor struggled to hold on to this dog, he said to one of his mates, ¿Y qué cosa sería si se lo echamos? They both supposedly laughed. We don't know which one of those sailors gave the final word, but when that dog heard the word tómalo, he ran off. But the leash did not release, and the sailor who was still attached to the leash received his karma immediately, being dragged all across the jungle floor. And even though the sailor was serving as an anchor to the dog's fury, he managed to find his mark. He ripped into the cacique, disemboweling him. He ran off with his insides. And this cacique, who was so loved by his people immediately began to wail and scream. They took what remained of him and put him in his cane. The record says that he didn't live for more than 3 days. And the sailor with the dog got back on the ship and left. Word spread fast, and the caciques of the island quickly learned about what happened in La Isla Saona. But the caciques of Higuey did something very different from the caciques of the other kingdom. They actually got together to talk about what was happening. Some of the caciques and cacicas and other important people that would have been present in some of these meetings include the following: Iguanoina, una cacique de Higuey; Guasiba, a guardian. His father was a Macori and his mother was a Taina. Legend says that he brought the sacred objects from the east, from Higuey, to Guaigui, and I understand that this is in La Vega. Guainima, another cacique of Higuey. Guaima, he was un guerrero ciguay. He was a servant of Guainima. And when Guainima was attacked during battle, where he was ultimately killed, when a Spanish soldier plunged a pickaxe into his back, Guaima pulled out the pickaxe from Guainima's body and plunged it into his assassin, bringing justice to his master. Guaima continued to fight in the battle, but was ultimately also killed. Onaneng, a princess of Higuey, renowned for her beauty. Quahigüey, he was a warrior that, in the second war with Higuey, played a vital role in keeping the Spanish away from a special location that I'll tell you about a little bit. And there were probably in the crowd that gathered some of the cacicas and caciques who we later see in the census of 1514. Some of them were Carolina de Agara, Catalina de Abaco, Maria de Higuey, Isabel de Guanama, and Juan Bravo. And amongst the people that gathered, there might have been a little boy who later on was named Juan, who will learn about what happens to him after the wars of Higuey. But the main speaker at these meetings was probably the most powerful cacique in the region that was still left, and his name was Cotubanama, or some scholars write his name as Cotubanama. He was considered a grand cacique and warrior. Maybe could have helped plan what happened next. Because the Ciguayos of La Isla Saona weren't just going to sit around and do nothing about what happened to their cacique. The next time a vessel made port on the island, they attacked it, knowing that the indigenous people on the island did not want anything to do with the Spanish, because before the Spanish left, they were very clear, do not come back here. The Spanish had the audacity to send out a ship to populate the island. The ship had about 8 Spanish on them, and when it docked, the indigenous people came out and attacked. Some say it was 3, some say it was all 8, which I doubt because someone had to go back and let Ovando, who was the governor at this time, know what was going on. The point is, they exacted revenge for their cacique, but they also knew already about the awful, cruel treatment that the Spanish were giving to all of their people. So the Ciguayos knew that the Spanish would be back for blood. When Nicolás de Ovando heard about what the natives of La Saona had done to the expedition, he lost it. El Comandador de Lares then sent out a proclamation to the 4 settlements of villas de los españoles, which were Santiago, Concepción de la Vega, El Bonao, y Santo Domingo. And the Spanish settlers heeded the call. They ran over there. Why? Because there was a law that said that if any of the natives rebelled against the Spanish, they no longer were free vassal subjects of the queen. They were now legally allowed to be captured alive and enslaved. Because there was a difference between the free indigenous population who were giving in the repartimiento, encomenderos, etc. These people were supposed to be paid for their labor, and it was written into law. Did it happen all the time? We already know no. However, those who were enslaved, that was a different story entirely. So Comandador de Lares was able to get between 300 and 400 settlers to join him. And Juan de Esquivel was named captain of this army. Each group also had separate captains for each area that they had. They set out in boats towards La Isla Saona. They landed on the shores of La Isla Saona and proceeded to try to figure out where they were. But the Ciguayos were ready. They had already laid a trap. As the Spanish got closer to the shore, they realized there were 2 paths available, but one was full of rubble, basically impassable, and the other one looked more passable. They were able to go through it. But the Spanish, with their many years of conquest from the Canary Islands and back many, many years, quickly realized that this was a trap. The path that they saw that was easier to navigate was probably going to lead them to an ambush. So they went through the impassable path, taking away bits of trunks and all kinds of vegetation to get through the path. And they were right. The Tainos were waiting for them in the path, at the end of the path that was clear. And by them going into the impassable path, they ended up actually going behind them. And unfortunately, the Tainos ended up getting ambushed. Even so, they fought hard against the Spanish as much as they could. The Tainos used their bows and arrows with their tips poisoned. They also threw rocks. They also used different weapons, but the Spanish did as well. The Spanish had several weapons. They in particular liked la ballesta, which we know as a crossbow. And even though these weapons were a little bit slower, they were very effective. Juan de Esquivel and his 400 men were able to capture about 600 Tainos. These captives were put inside a bollo and it was lit on fire. Las Casas says that he took out all the bodies and he counted them one by one, and that he counted about 700. Everyone else who was captured alive was taken as a slave. But many fled and managed to go into the other island, into La Española. But this caused a massive problem. Now, La Villa de Santo Domingo didn't have food, so the Spanish began to starve. Because it was La Isla Saona that mainly provided the casabe that they consumed. But the devastation of this war was so great on the indigenous people that they actually sent messengers to Ovando and told him, you know what, we don't want war. Tell us what you want. And Ovando promised not to make them slaves. So once again, El Casabe saved the Spanish because they were also desperate for this first war with Higuey to end. Everybody was starving. And what made things worse, that with Ovando had arrived more people. So more people to feed when there was barely any food. And now destroying the relationship that they had with their only source, really, of food was ridiculous. So I'm pretty sure that if it hadn't been because the Spanish had no idea how to make this, they would have just destroyed everybody. Peace was successfully obtained by the indigenous people only because the Spanish were interested in their labor. To formalize this peace, their main cacique, Cotubanamá, met up with Juan de Esquivel. Cotubanamá was described in an interesting way by Bartolomé de las Casas. He says the following: Este cacique y señor era estimado por el más esforzado de toda aquella provincia, y era el más lindo y dispuesto hombre que entre 1000 hombres de cualquiera nación, creo yo, que se hallara. Tenía el cuerpo mayor que los de los otros. Creo también que tenía una vara de medir entera de espalda a espalda. La cintura la ciñeran con una cinta de 2 palmos o muy poquito más. Tenía la llave de las manos de un gran palmo, los brazos y las piernas y todo lo demás. A los otros miembros muy proporcionado, el gesto no hermoso, sino de hombre fiero y muy grave. Su arco y flechas era del doblado gordor que los de los otros hombres. In other words, this guy was big. And it was something that was notable about los Higuayos. They weren't of a smaller stature as the other Tainos. They were known to be bigger and strong. In this meeting, Cotubanama decided to perform un guatia. A guatia was a special ceremony that the indigenous people would perform between 2 groups of people. It represented brotherhood, represented peace. In this ceremony, they would exchange names. So Cotubanama was no longer known as Cotubanama. His name now was Juan de Esquivel. As Bartolomé de las Casas describes, quedaron como perpetuos amigos y hermanos en armas. Y así los indios llamaban al capitán, Cotubano, another form of his name, y el señor Juan de Esquivel, meaning al cacique, le decían Juan de Esquivel. And it was expected that the Spanish would respect this ceremony. It was supposed to be permanent. But this ceremony also lets us know why so many indigenous people ended up with Spanish names. They did this so often, trying to gain peace and never being able to attain. As part of this deal, this peace treaty, Juan de Esquivel, the actual Spanish, built a fort very near the main yucayeque of los Tainos de Higuey. Y dice Bartolomé que hizo edificar una fortaleza de madera en cierto pueblo de indios, algo cerca de la mar, metido en la tierra, donde le pareció convenir, y dejó allí hombres con un capitán llamado Martín de Villamán. But as we've seen time and time again, the Spanish had no respect for the indigenous people. As they always had done, began to steal more women, because this is something they were already doing, stealing more daughters, more granddaughters, not giving a damn. The first war was around April 1502. It lasted several months. And now the Taino people of Higuey were under complete control of the Spanish. Ovando was more than happy with what he had done to them. While all of this is going on, those who had been taken as slaves were being separated from their families, from everything they knew. As Bartolomé describes, y despedida la gente de los españoles, cada uno se tornó a la villa de donde había venido, con la parte que le venía de los esclavos. So something we have to know of the First War is that the Spanish, the 300 to 400 Spanish settlers who went with Juan de Esquivel, they had to pay everything out of their own pocket. The Spanish government paid nothing. Even so, all of the booty or everything that they captured, including the slaves from the indigenous population, had to go, some of it had to go to the crown. And we know that in the documents that we have, it says that 25 piezas de esclavos de los de la Primera Guerra de Higuey went to the queen. But the Spanish were extremely angry about having to give their slaves to the Spanish crown. They were so angry that they sent Juan de Esquivel back to Spain to petition for them. Because we know that in 1503, at the end of 1503, we know that Juan de Esquivel y Francisco Velázquez were at court. And they had, as it states here, con ellos una serie de peticiones de los avecindados que tuvieron la certificación más cumplida. By now, it's 1503. There's peace for a couple of months. And the last straw for the entire island was when Ana Caona was hung in Santo Domingo. This caused chaos all over the island. Because Ana Caona was captured in La Masacre de Jaragua, it took several months for her to be executed. But the people who ran off during the massacre, which I covered in a few videos back, they ended up running mostly to Higuey. We know that the Spanish who were left at that fort that was built after the First War of Higuey, those men in that fort continued to abuse the indigenous population. And again, I will repeat it. They kept kidnapping and taking the daughters, the granddaughters, the wives of the indigenous men, because they had been promised not to be taken as slaves to Santo Domingo. However, they were forced to plant a very large amount of yuca to make el casabe. They not only had to make the casabe, which was the work of the women, the men then had to take the casabe to Santo Domingo, where they were then obligated to work. They got fed up. They got fed up of all the abuse and the mistreatment. So what did they do? They lit that fort on fire. Of the 9 men who were stationed at this fort, 8 of them were killed. The 9th man managed to escape. He ran all the way to Santo Domingo to tell Ovando what happened. Ovando was furious. And he said, "Le declaramos la guerra a sangre y fuego." He commanded, once again, that every single able-bodied Spanish man had to get ready for war from all of the settlement. He called upon, once again, Juan de Esquivel por capitán general y también capitán de Santiago. Y de Santo Domingo nombró a Juan Ponce de León, el capitán de la Concepción, Diego de Escobar. And the captain for Bonao isn't mentioned by name. This time, only 300 Spanish settlers joined in this second war of Higuey, which occurred around the summer of 1504. And we know this because Juan de Esquivel was in Spain in 1503. And we know that he had to arrive a little bit before the summer of 1504 in order to be involved in this war. The participation of Juan de Esquivel is a little bit of a debate, but I'm not going to go into that. What we are aware of, though, is that during these wars of Higuey, it was very obvious a trend that would continue on for centuries, which was the 2 different tribes fighting each other. Bartolomé de las Casas says that the tribes that would help the Spanish was because they feared them, that they didn't do it because they wanted to. However, we do have evidence through what happened with Guacanagari that some of the indigenous people from the get-go helped the Spanish. One historian notes that it wasn't only the indigenous people's conflicting matters that made this war very interesting. We also have the fact that Bartolomé de las Casas is said to have participated in this war against the indigenous people. And not only him, but also his father, Pedro de las Casas, and his uncle, because it was a family affair, and his uncle, Gabriel de Peñalosa, were supposedly under the command of Juan de Esquivel. Because of Bartolomé's participation in the Second War, we can have more confidence in his descriptions of what happened. He was not there in the First War. Why? We're not sure why. However, many scholars think that he might have been sick at the time. As word spread of the preparations that the Spanish were making to invade Higuey, Bartolomé says that the indigenous people employed an interesting method of communication that I personally had never heard that they used on the island. Bartolomé states, así que llegado la gente de los españoles a los límites de aquella provincia y sentida por las gentes de ella, hacen por todas partes grandes ahumadas, unos pueblos a otros avisándose, y luego ponían las mujeres y los hijos y viejos en cobro en lo más secreto que aquellos allá podían y sabían de los mundos. The indigenous people used smoke signals to communicate with each other and let each Yucayeque know that the Spanish were approaching. I had always wondered, how did the Tainos know? How were they aware of when these people were coming? I had read in several places that they had runners, kind of like the Romans, that they would send off to warn the other villages. But this method, I had heard of it for other native tribes, especially in North America. But for the Tainos to have done this was an interesting bit of information. So this was the way that they warned each other of the incoming invasion, and they also were able to gather each other up and talk. Even with all this chaos, they were able to have a secret meeting, or at least that's what legend says. Legend says that within a cave in a place called Anamuya, filled with petroglyphs, which are basically images that have been carved into the stone, not painted, as can be seen here. Some of these images, and I'm going to make a whole video later on about the finds at this site, but some of these images would have been already ancient in the time of the Taino. And legend says that while the Second Higuey War was being fought, main Taino caciques were having a secret meeting at this sacred place. This place has two sections, from what I understand. There's the cave portion, or el trono de la reina, which is not very tall, it's about 2 meters high, but is filled with the petroglyphs. And then there's this piece, which is on the ground, and many archaeologists believe that this is a ceremonial bate. And if we remember, un bate was the main plaza of a Yucayeque. They believe that this one was special, mostly because of all these petroglyphs on the surface of this volcanic rock. And the legend says that the caciques here were all trying to figure out what to do about the Spanish. At the end, their conclusion was they told their women to sleep with the Spanish in order to prevent the complete disappearance of their people. Is this true? Did the elders and the caciques meet at this place and make this decision? We don't know. But we do know that most legends are based on some sort of fact. It is known that the elders and the caciques of Higuey had more communication with each other. They weren't as independent from each other as the other caciques and Yucayeques seemed to be. As the Spanish approached Higuey, it is said that Juan de Esquivel went killing every single indigenous person, man, woman, and child he could. As they fought, the Spanish were also aware of following different leads, thinking that it would lead to Cotubanamá. At one point, 13 Spanish followed a trail. Basically, they found signs of that someone had gone through there. And at the end of this trail, they found over 1,000 women and children. They used the crossbow so much that the strings would burst from so much use. The women and children and elders tried to flee. Some managed to escape, but most were captured or killed. Bartolome describes how the indigenous people of Higuey were so fierce that even when an arrow pierced them all the way to the feathers, they would still yank out the arrow from their bodies, break it with their teeth, and throw it before the Spanish. They would still ultimately die. But that act for them was a form of defiance. Because Bartolome de las Casas was present during this battle, he made certain observations and he managed to catch their interaction between Higuey, who was one of the indigenous people I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and his interaction during the fight with a Spanish named Alejos Gomez. We know that Higuey was a very tall man because, as I've mentioned, the indigenous people of Higuey were suspected to actually be Ciguayos, and the Ciguayos were very tall. Because of his stature, he was very agile. So what Bartolome describes is that Alejos Gomez saw this big, tall indigenous man and thought, oh, this is fun. This would be a challenge. Let's fight without any weapons. The Taino jumped and was able to not get hit once by the Spanish. What Bartolome describes is more of like them being in awe of his agility. It's a little confusing in terms of to distinguish if this is like a legend or if this actually happened. Because part of it says that this man, this Taino, had come from Ture. I explained in my video about Taino religion and myths that for the Taino, Ture meant heaven. So many cronistas said that the Tainos believed that the Spanish came from Ture, or from heaven. And his main purpose was to basically distract the Spanish so that the elders and caciques of the different Yucayeques could have that meeting in Anamuya or Anamuya. So it's kind of hard to understand if this was like an apparition. Was he a ghost? Because he was able to avoid being injured by Alejos Gomez, but also by 2 other Spanish. In the end, the indigenous people that were watching this, because supposedly the battle stopped to watch how Higuey outmaneuvered these people. The people who were observing began to laugh at the Spanish. Bartolome says that this battle lasted from 2 o'clock in the afternoon until nightfall, and that the next day, not one of the indigenous people who were battling against the Spanish appeared, because the battle obviously stopped at nightfall. Everybody went to sleep. So when they saw that nobody came, the Spanish went out to the Yucayeques to find them. And it was apparent that Cotubanama's entire Yucayeque had disappeared. They proceeded then to hide in the jungle. Bartolome de las Casas says that the Spanish began to hunt down all the people who had escaped. And some of the Spanish were so good at tracking people that they could smell just a little bit of smoke from their fires or a twisted leaf that was just a little bit off, and they could find the natives anywhere in the mountains. So they would find them, grab them, at times obviously kill them, and then at other times torture them so that they would give the location of other people who were hiding in the mountain. And since these were captives and rebels against the crown, they were automatically enslaved. So that's how they used them as slaves. They would gather up to 20 indigenous people and would force them to forage for food and for roots, because they had the same problem as they had in the first war against Higuey. They forgot to plan for supplies. And so some were fighting and some were starving. Just That's just smart. The roots that the natives would dig up were called guayagas. And this root was indigenous to Higuey, meaning that they didn't find these in other areas of the island. So the Tainos of Higuey, they had figured out a way of using this root that was poisonous. Similar to the la yuca that was currently being used at that time, that was also poisonous. So they also had a process to make these roots edible. And the way they did that was that they would get the roots, grind them up, then press them to remove all the liquid, because in the liquid is where they had the venom, right? The poison. Once all the liquid was out of the la masa, right, of the dough, they would then spread out this dough in the hot sun and allow it to rot. As it rotted, it began to produce worms or maggots. And once it was full of maggots, they then proceeded to form little balls and then basically make un tipo de casabe or tortilla. You can see it that way as well. And put it on fire, toast it on fire, not on a budén though, not like the yuca to make the casabe. This was a different way of toasting these pieces of dough. And on top of that, not only was it full of maggots, it would turn black. So this was what the Spanish were forced to eat for those months that they were outside of the city fighting in this war. An interesting point that Las Casas makes is that while they were forcing these people to look for these roots, they were chained up, right? They had chains on their hands. And so because the Spanish didn't know how to find these things, they kind of would take them wherever they said that they needed to go, and they kind of zone out. And the indigenous people would take advantage of them zoning out, would take the chains, wrap it around the Spanish neck, and choke them. And they managed to escape because they would end up suffocating them. And they would run off to Cotubanamá and celebrate these victories. However, those who didn't manage to escape, who were captured and then killed by the Spanish, most of the time they were gathered in groups of 13 and either hung or burned alive. The ones who were executed in this way were usually brought to wherever El Capitán General was. In this case, Juan de Esquivel. Las Casas says that at one point their cries were so loud that Juan de Esquivel actually came out of wherever he was, tent, fortress, whatever, and kind of told them, hey, this needs to stop because this is disturbing me. So there was obviously something in him, that some human part in him still. But the executioner did not want to stop. So he stuffed their mouths with wood so that Juan de Esquivel didn't have to hear them. Tainos did everything to try to defeat the Spanish. Not only with the hunger part, but they also would destroy their water wells. And this technology was more seen in Higuey, where they had special kind of water wells called Higueyes, where they had fresh water for their villages or the yucayeques to drink. But the main purpose of this expedition was really to capture El Cacique. As his people were being searched for by the Spanish up in the mountains, Cotubanama had already fled with his family and those who wanted to follow him to La Isla Saona, which was technically abandoned. In a large cave, he managed to keep his family safe. But Juan de Esquivel managed to get the information out of some of the captives because Cotubanama would send out spies, just like Atué did, in order to keep himself safe. But since Juan de Esquivel now knew where he was, he designed a plan to get to the island of Saona at night. A historian says that apparently he had sent 2 spies to watch the sea, but they were late. And by the time they made it to the coast to watch out for ships, Juan de Esquivel had already docked and 30 Spanish had landed in La Isla Saona. They supposedly went to the highest point on the island. And from there, they were able to see the 2 spies that Cotubanama had sent, they captured them. They then proceeded to ask where the cacique was. They supposedly said that he was nearby, also trying to make sure that the coast was clear. Using the indigenous man that they captured, because the other one, unfortunately, they stabbed to death, they made him basically guide them towards El Cacique. They come to a path where it divided left and right. We saw this earlier in the other war. But this time, both paths are clear. So most of the Spanish decide to go through the right path. But there was only one Spanish that decided to go through the left path. The Spanish who decided to go down the left path was named Juan Lopez. Here, their account is a little fuzzy because it says that apparently the guides find Cotubanama in the trail. However, the one person that went down that trail was supposedly Juan Lopez. So did he take the one indigenous man that was still alive and the other dudes didn't? And it doesn't explain. What it does say is that because of the way the land basically graded down, you couldn't see who was coming up and you couldn't see who was coming down towards you. Bartolomé de las Casas has a really bad way of writing and it makes it very confusing. But apparently whoever was in the front, that it says it was the indigenous persons who were guiding the Spanish, all of a sudden glimpse the cacique and they shut up, like they go mute. So the Spanish were like, where is he? What's going on? And the indigenous people say he's right behind you. And saying this, they take off. They abandon Cotubanama and leave him to his fate with Juan Lopez. Lopez takes out his sword and goes towards the cacique. The account says that the cacique hadn't seen a sword. Again, this is what it makes it difficult to understand what's happening. Because we know that Cotubanama had fought with the Spanish before. So how is this the first time he's seeing a sword? And supposedly, because it's the first time he's seeing a sword, he grabs the sword that Lopez is trying to stab him with his hands. And as he's trying to hold the sword, Lopez pulls the sword out of his hands and cuts his hand. As Lopez prepares to give the final stab, Cotubanama says his famous phrase, Maya ni macana, Juan de Esquivel, daca. No me mates, soy Juan de Esquivel. Because even with all of this, he respected the guatiao that he had performed with the captain. There were other indigenous people with the cacique who all fled. But even with his hands bleeding, Cotubanama doesn't give up. He continues to fight for the sword, and seeing that he couldn't, he throws his body against Juan Lopez, who was known to be a big wide man. He rams him into the rocks, forces him to fall, and in the struggle, Cotubanama manages to get Juan Lopez in a headlock. As he strangles him, Juan Lopez is making a lot of noise. And so the other Spanish who on the other trail heard him and they began to run towards the sound. When they finally arrive, Juan Lopez is almost in the other world and he is struggling to stay alive. The first to arrive to their struggle was a settler who had a crossbow, but the crossbow was dismantled because it had been used so much. So he whacked Cotubanama on the head to get him off of Juan Lopez. Juan Lopez survived, and the other Spanish managed to then capture Cotubanama. They took him to the abandoned Yucayeque on the island, and from there, they went to search for his wife and children. They first tried to burn him alive, but when they went to do so, one of them, we don't know who, or if it was el mismo Juan de Esquivel, decided, you know what, let's take him to Ovando, Comendador Mayor, because he will torture him more than we can. So they loaded him, his wife, and his children, and all of the other indigenous people that they had captured onto the ships and sailed to Santo Domingo. There, bloodied and in chains, he was given to Ovando. And what a disappointment to them, because Ovando decided to just hang him instead of burning him alive as they expected. We now know that for Ovando, the nobility, which these caciques represented, should not have been burned, should not have been tortured. He honestly believed that because of their nobility status, they should be hung, which was reserved in that time for those of the noble status. In total, La Segunda Guerra de Higüey lasted about 8 to 10 months. By March of 1505, Higüey was completely under Spanish rule. So what ended up happening to the rest of the Tainos who were enslaved by the Spanish after the Second War of Higüey? We know that these particular slaves were sent to Santo Domingo, and they were used to construct the new city that Ovando had transferred to the other side of the Rio in 1502. And one of those constructions that they were forced to make was La Fortaleza, Osama. We also know that from both of these wars and Jaragua, several of these indigenous people were sent to Sevilla, to Spain, and their descendants were later in different situations. We have record of one little boy that was captured and taken as a slave during the second or the first, we're not sure, Guerra de Higüey. Because yes, even children were taken and enslaved, even though they didn't participate at all in the war. This little boy was called Juan. We don't know his original name. He was sent to Sevilla. Once in Sevilla, he was sold to a master. We know him as Francisco Velázquez. And in 1525, so 20 years later, Francisco Velázquez sues Juan for running away. And it was the story of Higuey that Francisco Velázquez used to describe Juan's character. He comes from these people that are rebellious and don't listen to the crown. We don't know what happened to Juan. However, his experience was the experience of many other Tainos who ended up being kidnapped and sold in Spain. They later on could get their freedom and integrate into Spanish society, and thus the memory of them was lost. The death of Cotubanama blanketed the region of Higuey. We don't hear of many other rebellions that was described in this way. Whole groups, different yucayekes coming together. It doesn't mean that other rebellions didn't happen, but they happened on a smaller scale and more individuals. We know also that some of the other slaves were given to Juan Ponce de Leon. He then proceeded to take these slaves from Higuey and take them to Boriquen. From there, as this man was restless and I don't know what was wrong with him, he would take these same slaves to Florida. And so we have a group of Tainos from Higuey who basically ended up traveling all around the Caribbean because of this madman. That's another story, though. The Tainos of Higuey were such a remarkable group of people who were unafraid to defend themselves and their culture and their way of life. Everything that I learned about them just made me admire them more and more. I hope you guys have enjoyed it so far. I hope you share it. These are stories that have been hidden, stories that we weren't taught in most of our formative years. And they weren't taught for a reason. Just remember that.